G'day guys, how are you? Hope everyone's well, and I hope you guys enjoyed the tasting on Saturday, the Chenin Blanc tasting. Quite a few of you joined in. We ran out those bottles pretty quick last week, so I'm assuming people enjoyed it. Feedback was good. I think you all seem to fall into one of the other camps pretty quickly, whether it's South African or whether it was the French. Lots of you saw where I was coming from with the Vouvray, the semi-dry stuff. A lot of you preferred the crisp and clean version that South Africa knockout, so it was good fun. And you know what I love about the feedback I'm getting from you guys now is how you might say to me, well, I could taste gooseberries and I was getting some lime in there, and I'll be thinking, well, I'm getting melons and I'm getting a bit of guava. It's great hearing your vernacular and how you describe the wines and how that'll feedback to me, and I'll think about that next time I'm tasting it, and I hope the same for you. You think of the things I'm saying. It's a nice way to expand your language and to think about how you can describe wine to your friends or just to yourself when you're tasting it. What does that taste like? Oh yeah, it's got that green gauge thing that Phil was talking about. Or I might be trying a wine and think, do you know what? It's got that kind of petroleum smell to it that somebody else mentioned. So good fun, and I'm hoping you guys will join me again this week for a Chardonnay tasting. Chardonnay is an interesting grape. It's used in so many different wines, blends, and in varietals, and sparkling wines. And we've got a couple of bottles we're going to be tasting this week. What I'd like you guys to do, if you do want to join in, is, as I mentioned last week, let me know ASAP, and we can get those wines allocated to you for Friday delivery in time for Saturday, so you can pop them in the fridge, have them chilled out. Most of you got back to me that you're interested by either the weekend previously or by Monday, Tuesday you've got to me, which is great. So there's not many bottles left, guys. We've only got maybe 3 bottles of each left. So if you are interested, let me know today. If you can, we'll pop those aside for you, and then from there on in, if we're out and you are interested in joining in, then I'd recommend you go to the supermarket, and I'll tell you at the end of this chat what you should be looking for, okay guys? So without further ado, quick chat about the grape today, and then obviously we'll taste on Saturday. So Chardonnay, not everyone's favorite grape. We'll get to that in a moment, but it is one of the most widely planted grapes. I think it's, there's something like 500,000 acres of the stuff grown or around the world. Second most widely planted white grape after a Spanish varietal called RN, which is a real workhorse grape, gets in everywhere. Trebbiano is another one. I think in France it's the second most widely planted grape as well to Ugni Blanc, I think, which is in our house white. It's a lovely grape, a nice bit of flavour to that. And these days, really, you're going to find the grape everywhere. It's grown all over the world, including England, in fact, which is bizarre. But I've tasted it, and I've had a Blanc de Blanc from England, and it was really, really good. So where did this grape come from? What happened to it? Was it an amalgamation of other grapes? What is it? It sounds like it was first found, as usual, in France, where it was first cultivated anyway, in eastern France and Burgundy. The history of it, though, is a little bit confused. I think originally people thought it was basically a Pinot Blanc variety, basically the same as a Pinot Blanc and Pinot Noir from those two grapes. And it was our old buddies, the ampelographers, those guys that spend their time categorizing vines and just having fun drinking and looking at vines. It's a tough job, man. Those guys were the ones that identified this. They said, look, we've been looking at Pinot vine leaves. We've been looking very closely at the Chardonnay leaves. It's identical. It's the same thing. We can't tell a difference. So they hung up their ampelographer noteboards, and they rested back on their vine leaf laurels and said, that's it, it's done. Pop their feet up, probably poured themselves a glass of each. Happy days. However, those clever people that run DNA researching said, oh, it's a load of rubbish. Don't believe you. They, in California, in the University of California in Davies, they did a bit of research, did some DNA research, and they found that in actual fact, they think what happened was there was a grape from Croatia called the Gouais Blanc, and they think that came over with the Romans, good old Romans, came over them into eastern France, where the aristocracy were growing Pinot grapes. And the serfs, the peasants, that were subjugated by the Romans, obviously, and made to work for them, saw this grape they brought over, and they're like, hey, this is all right, we're going to have some of that. So they started to plant it and cultivate it themselves as a country grape. Over time, those plantings mingled with the Pinot plantings, made a hybrid, and that hybrid became what we now know as Chardonnay. And that's what the guys at University of California and Davis discovered. Anthropologists are probably gutted about that, and I'm sure they're still fighting that battle at the moment, but it seems like the DNA guys are probably right. So I'm taking their story anyway, guys. So from that point, what happened? Well, we thanked the Romans for their input, obviously. Thanked them for their sandals as well, and their big noses. It was all, really, they gave us a lot of good stuff. And then they obviously disappeared. Those grapes continued to grow. France continued to be a home for the Chardonnay for many centuries, really. I guess it grew away quietly in the background there. Over time, France became known for producing some fantastic Chardonnays in that region, in Burgundy. So you've got your Montrachet, you've got your Chablis, and then obviously a little bit further north of there, you've got your Champagne and your Blanc de Blancs. So the grape very much entrenched itself in French viticulture and the legend of French wine, but it wasn't really grown anywhere else. I don't think any of the New World countries, for example, were growing it particularly in the 70s. Maybe there's some small plantings here and there in Australia or whatever, but not a lot. So how did it become such a global grape? Well, that came about, it sounds like, by the co-ops, the cooperatives in France. So these are cooperatives of farmers that get together and utilize their combined weight and leverage to get their products to market for a good price, and use their power to distribute and market their products well. And they decided in the 80s to push the Chardonnay grape. Huge push in France. The grape became ever more popular in France, to the point where it became a commodity almost. This perked up the ears of the New World. So California and Australia very much picked up on this, and by the 90s, both of those markets were now growing so much Chardonnay that I think the Chardonnay grape became both of their primary plantings. They both went crazy for it. So that led to, I guess, kind of how you and I might know Chardonnay outside of France. The Australian Chardonnay in particular became very popular, so much so that they began to even blend it in Australia because they were running out of the grape. They could not grow enough of it to supply the demand for their Chardonnays. And what was available on hand, they had Semillon growing as well, so they started to blend their Semillon Chardonnays. Australian Semillon Chardonnay, ubiquitous. In the late 90s and the noughties, that stuff was everywhere. That's all you ever heard about. If you're having an Aussie wine, you could absolutely guarantee there's going to be a Sem Chardonnay or a straight Chardonnay. And similarly in California. Now the thing with the grape is, it can grow anywhere, but it's quite neutral. It's quite characterless on its own. So it doesn't have its own specific game it brings to the table, right? It can ripen early, it can ripen late. It's up to the terroir, it's up to the climate. You can oak it if you want. You can grow it in a hot climate if you like. You can grow it in a cool climate if you like. You can grow it on different kinds of soil. It will still get to a point where it's farmable and you can do something with it. So what that meant for the New World and for Australia in particular, I think, and California, was that they were able to churn out huge amounts of the grape. Now, you remember before I'd said to you that grapes quality is often very much affected by how many grapes a vine produces. Now, back in these days, the Aussies and the Californians were going for as much production as possible because the grape was flying out the doors. People wanted bottles of Chardonnay. They were doing it at a much cheaper price than had been traditional in France. And it was flooding our supermarkets, right? So the guys were trying to flood the markets with it. They did flood the markets with it, and they were trying to get as much out as possible. So they weren't paying particular attention to their vinification techniques. They weren't particularly growing the grapes well. They were just bog standard workhorse grapes, really. To try and get some kind of character to the wines, what they became known to do was often throw in oak chips into the vats of fermenting wine, which, look, it's going to impart a slight smokiness, a little bit of a fake oaky taste of the wines, but it's not the same as putting it in a good French oak barrel. It's more akin to probably putting it into an MDF barrel, to be honest. It's not going to really do that much great stuff for it. So when I was starting to drink this stuff back in the late 90s, noughties, I remember it being probably a bit too sweet for me, quite kind of flabby and a bit loose tasting, and yeah, this kind of weird smoky kind of oaky taste that wasn't great in it as well. Didn't leave a great aftertaste in your mouth, and the finish is always a bit horrible. And I think that became kind of what they were known as, you know, a cheap wine that you would take to a party if you were a kid, or if you were you wanted a few bottles of wine to knock back at a party, but it wasn't great stuff. This caused the inevitable backlash. So the grape went up and up and up, selling. It's going to have a fall. There's going to be an inevitable crash, right? There was. The connoisseurs, the wine tasters and the spectators at the time all backlashed against the production techniques that were being used, and the distance the grape had moved away from the quality it can have in France. Essentially, it was they kind of had a go at the grape for its lack of morals and allowing itself to be exploited so much, I think. What happened was this phrase came about eventually, I think around those times, sort of noughties, 90s, which is ABC, anything but Chardonnay. And it was directly aimed at the poor techniques and the shortcuts that were used with Chardonnay around the world to get this stuff out to mass market and give it some kind of character. You know, that was a long time ago. I remember my parents probably saying that to me, you know, when I was a lad at home still, before I'd left home even, like it was something that was around then in the 90s. And as I went to uni and stuff, you know, and then into the noughties, it was still prevalent. People would still say that, you know, people that knew would be like, oh, no way, man, I'm not touching Chardonnay. Then I kind of moved away from that field, and I went into other areas, and I stopped drinking that stuff and blah, blah, blah. I opened a wine bar in 2018. I asked people, what kind of whites do you like? People still say it. Anything but a Chardonnay, man. I'll drink anything. Don't give me a Chardonnay. So it's one of the most damaging verbal memes I think that's ever come out, you know, and it's still around the neck of Chardonnay. But luckily for us, it had an effect, and a good effect. What happened was that the market crashed a bit. It's still, obviously, as I said, it's still a hugely widely grown grape, but it's not as much of it's not a commodity like it was. You know, it's not a commodity like Prosecco or something. It's gone back to being produced in a more careful way with more thought behind it to try and make a grape that you want to drink as a nice bottle of wine, not as a cheap and cheerful something that's going to give you a headache. So Australia's definitely cleaned its act up, as has California, and the wines they're producing now are more often than not driven by the grape in terms of what brings out the best in that grape. They try to get the terroir to show through, and the good parts of the terroir to show through, to give a grape its taste. So, for example, in cooler climates, the grape's going to be very crisp, acidic, and clean tasting if it's grown correctly. If you grow it in a hot country, if you're growing it in Australia, down south, say, then it's going to take on some more fruity characteristics. It's going to get some more tropical flavors going on in there, as often happens, right, in the New World with white grapes. But they'll maintain the acidity if they've harvested at the right time. If they leave it on too long, it's going to get that sweetness to it. It's going to get a bit flabby, and that does still happen, don't get me wrong. But what I want to do with you guys on Saturday is to revisit the grape if you don't drink it anymore because you remember the bad old days, or if you've avoided it all your life because all you've ever heard from people is, oh, it's rubbish, don't drink Chardonnay. We're going to revisit it, and we're going to hopefully show you guys how sophisticated it can be, how approachable it can be, and what a great food wine it is. We're going to get 2 bottles in, as some of you know. So it's going to have, we're going to start with Chablis, so classic French, and we're going to compare that with a McLaren Vale d'Arenberg, and that Chardonnay is it's a straight Chardonnay from d'Arenberg. Chablis obviously speaks for itself. d'Arenberg, if you know much about Australian wine, you've probably heard of it. McLaren Vale you will have heard of, right? It's one of the foremost winemaking regions, and it's got vines dating back to the 1850s. It's got a great history of wine growing, and the d'Arenberg family name is probably one of the first in Australia for making wine. It certainly thinks of itself that way, and that's half the battle, isn't it? But no, they have a great pedigree. The wine is it is different to the Chablis, and we'll get to that on Saturday, but they're both excellent wines and both good examples of what the grape can be. So I'm looking forward to that. I don't normally drink Chardonnay, not because I don't like it, just maybe a habit, I don't know. But when I do drink white wine, I do like champagne, obviously, but I'd often go for a Chablis actually, but not maybe an Australian one. So Australian Chardonnay for me is not something I drink, and that may be a hang-up for me as well with what happened back in the day. So I'm looking forward to trying a good Aussie one. I hope you guys are too. And as I said, if you have got your bottles from me already lined up, great. If you haven't, there's a few bottles left. Hurry up and let me know, and we'll get them to you by Friday. If you are going to go to the supermarket and get your own, then all I need to tell you really is try and get yourself a McLaren Vale straight Chardonnay varietal, no blending in there, just a Chardonnay from McLaren Vale if you can, and obviously a Chablis. Chablis varies in price greatly. Obviously, you've got a Petit Chablis, you've got your Premier Cru, your Grand Crus, so you can spend what you want on it, guys. It's up to you, but I am going for a straight Chablis, so it's not one of your Premier Crus and it's not a Petit, it's just a nice little mid-level one. So yeah, I recommend you try and get one of them if you can, if you're not going to go for ours. And yeah, get yourself a straight Chardonnay from d'Arenberg if you can see it. If you can't, a McLaren Vale will do. We'll reconvene then, and I'm looking forward to it. Till then, guys, have a lovely evening. Speak to you soon.